my goodness, look around. If this isn't collapse, what do you call it? You know, the standard of living is going down for many people. The climate is moving in directions which threaten the existence of this country. The US presidential election is being held between two of the most awful people I ever saw in public life. You know, the oil companies are in a desperate rush to pump the last bit of oil out of the ground, leaving nothing for the future. Is this collapse, or is this, what do you call this if you don't call it collapse? We are in a period of collapse now, which will intensify. What's happening now is that the economic system is changing humans. You know, we create some indicator in the economic system, and then immediately human institutions swing around to try and maximize that indicator. I mean, and we need to get out of that trap. I think an important thing to realize is that the economic system doesn't exist somehow out there independent of us. We created it. It's a tool for us. And by and large, it serves the purposes of the people who created it. So rather than asking how do you change the economic system, I would say, how do you get people to have different goals? If they have different goals, then they will create a new economic system to satisfy the goals that they have. So the problem isn't the system, it's the goals. And we have a really dysfunctional economic system, which is driving us to collapse, because we have a set of goals that are dysfunctional and are driving us to collapse.
What goals should we have?
Well, I don't tell you what goals you should have, but I would encourage you to decide for yourself what goals you should have. I mentioned this morning this exercise, just sit down and list what's really important to you. Surprisingly enough, economics, certainly in the rich countries, doesn't show up. You know, what you really want is health, friendship, security, self-satisfaction, and so forth. And these are not things which are going to come from expanding the GDP necessarily. So I don't tell you which ones to have, but I would say you should at least ask that question for yourself.
What do you think is the thing that is most lacking in global policy?
I think we need to understand there isn't such a thing as global policy. There's just 7 billion people getting up every morning and doing something. In some cases, they're quite similar. In other cases, they're very different from each other. And the result of what they do, somehow we term global policy. But it's not like somebody asks, what is the global policy? People rather say, what are these 7 billion people trying to accomplish? I'm personally against globalization because I know we're going to make mistakes. People make mistakes. That's what they do. If you have a bunch of relatively independent units, countries, people, whatever, economies, one of them can make a fatal mistake and collapse, and it doesn't have too much influence on the others. But if you have a global entity and it makes a mistake, which for sure it will, the whole thing collapses. And that's the situation we have now. So, I mean, speaking in a kind of funny way, I would say the goal of global policy ought to be to eliminate that there is any global policy. It should be to break things back up again. You have to give up certain short-term gains, but the benefit is you have a chance to survive. You know, in the old days, we had many great empires: China, the Persians, the Romans. The Germanic Empire was important for a time. You know, the Persians could collapse, or the Romans could collapse, as they did, and it by and large didn't affect too much the other empires. But now, you know, you have Italy's banks go bankrupt, and suddenly the whole global system is having problems. That's the consequence of globalization.
Who is responsible if somehow we fail to avert a 21st century collapse?
The person who's responsible is the one who goes around saying who's responsible, because everybody's involved in this. Nobody is responsible for these things. It's a collective fault. You know, so I have a friend, and she gets very mad at me sometimes. She says, "You made me whatever, late. You made me, I don't know." And I say, "No, I didn't make you do anything. I created, you know, we interact, and out of that interaction, you were late. Is it my fault? Well, I was part of the system, but I wasn't the one who had to solve it. You know, I mean, that's it. We're in a big system. There is no one who's responsible. I mean, limits to growth made this point. We took the standard scenario. We said, you know, what happened? Well, overshoot and collapse. Why? And then you analyze the data. Actually, interestingly enough, in that standard scenario in 1972, the first standard scenario collapse is caused by food shortages. But what happens if you've solved the food shortages? Suppose you say, well, the agriculture sector is responsible, we solve the problem. It doesn't bring utopia. It simply means the pressures have to mount in some other system, resources or energy or whatever. So, in English we call this scapegoating, which means pointing the finger at somebody and saying, you know, you are responsible, not I. Don't look at me. You know, you were the one. No, the world isn't like that. Then you can say, well, if we see collapse in the 21st century, we are seeing collapse in the 21st. I mean, my goodness, look around. If this isn't collapse, what do you call it? You know, the standard of living is going down for many people. The climate is moving in directions which threaten the existence of this country. The U.S. presidential election is being held between two of the most awful people I ever saw in public life. You know, the oil companies are in a desperate rush to pump the last bit of oil out of the ground, leaving nothing for the future. Is this collapse, or is this, what do you call this if you don't call it collapse? We are in a period of collapse now, which will intensify.
What do you fear the most?
What do I personally fear the most? So this question was asked this morning. I put down Alzheimer's. I fear getting Alzheimer's. Actually, honestly speaking, that's the thing which is most concerning to me, is that I wouldn't be able anymore to communicate good ideas.